Sometimes we look back on the time of Jesus and we think things were very different then than they are now, and in many ways they were. But there were a lot of the same people. We have bankers now. They had bankers then. They had lawyers. They had shopkeepers. They had tent makers. Well, we don't have many tent makers. They had people who worked in construction. Jesus was one of those. There were farmers who worked in the fields, and there were people who had vineyards, gardeners, and so on. But one of the big differences between then and now was almost everybody walked everywhere. Now, we heard in the story from the Acts of the Apostles, the Ethiopian eunuch who was going in a chariot. That was rare, but it was still about walking speed. I mean, the Spirit of God said to Philip, go and stay near that chariot. He didn't say, grab your motorcycle or your bicycle and keep up with the chariot, just go and stay near it. So it was obviously at a pace that a person could maintain. You see things differently when you're walking than you do when you're whizzing by in a car or in an airplane or in a train or in a train underneath the city or certainly any other fast mode of transportation. Even on a bicycle, you don't see nearly as much as you do when you're walking. And because we all go so quickly, most of us have probably never seen the whole cycle of the growing of grapes. But not just because we don't go at that speed, but mostly because none of us have vineyards nearby where we live. So we may not be intimately aware of what happens when the gardener prunes the grapevine. And what happens if the gardener does not prune the grapevine? Jesus said, I am the vine, you are the branches, and my Father is the gardener. Remember last week we talked about Jesus, I am the good shepherd. There are a lot of I ams. This is another one of these I ams. I am the vine, you are the branches. Now, I don't know whether you ever sit and look at trees grow. I do, sometimes. And I wonder why they grow up. Why don't they grow every other way? Why don't they kind of creep along the ground? Some do, but not many. Mostly, trees grow up. Most plants grow up. And they all desire sunlight. And in fact, they grow up and not every other way because in plants, the leading edge of the plant, the part closest to the sun, the one that gets the most sunlight, produces a hormone which inhibits growth in the rest of the plant. So when you have a tree with a lot of leaves and twigs growing, all of those hormones are working their way back down so that branches don't come anymore out of the trunk. It's all produced by the leading edge. If you cut off the leading edge, then that suppressing hormone is no longer there, and things begin to grow every other place. So you've probably all seen those really fancy trees that have twists and turns all over the place where they're pruned back every year and they become really complicated. And that's all because when the tips are cut off, the suppressing hormone is gone and it tries to grow everywhere. Well, what would happen with a grapevine if you didn't prune it? What would happen if you just let it go? Well, what would happen is that it would become large and it would have an abundance of fruit. So much fruit that the roots couldn't keep up to it. And the fruit would be small and hard and not full and lush. So part of the purpose of why we prune grapevines as human beings is to keep the amount of grapes at a manageable level for the vine to be able to support it. And that's part of that purpose. Now, we know all about those hormones now, and they didn't in Jesus' day, but it didn't make any difference. They still understood what was going on. If you don't prune it, it grows too big, you have lots of grapes, the thing gets overextended, next year it hardly does anything. Jesus talked about, I am the vine and you are the branches, and you must remain in me. Now, one of the things about grapevines and fruit trees and rose bushes and so on is that the very beautiful and fancy or delicious products of those rose bushes or grapevines or fruit trees often come with very weak root systems. So you get a new variety of rose or apple or whatever by cross-pollinating two different species. That gives you a new species. But the roots may not be very good. But you got a new delicious apple out of the thing. What you do is you cut off that branch that has the new variety of apple and you graft it into a tree that has really good roots. And now you've got strong roots and a delicious new apple. When we lived in our last place, we had, at St. Timothy's, we planted, when we first came there, a variety of fruit trees because we thought this time we're going to be here long enough to reap the harvest, and we were. We had an apple tree with 6 varieties on it, and a pear tree with 5 varieties. And so those trees had grafted into them different types of trees. I don't remember what the varieties. Never got to taste the apples or the pears, but the squirrels were well fed, I'll have you know. Though we did beat the squirrels to the plums because the plum harvest was so enormous that they couldn't keep up with the amount of plums, and we beat them to some of them. We got a few bushels, actually. Those varieties of fruits grew because they were grafted into the tree. And Jesus said, you need to be grafted into me. I'm the vine. And what does the vine do? What does the strong root stalk do? It produces the nutrients for life. Now, some people think that in order to be a devout Christian, you have to be just like every other Christian doing what everybody does. Or you have to be just like Jesus and do exactly what he did. One of the wonderful things about a particular variety of fruit being grafted into a sturdy tree is that the sturdiness comes from the tree, the strength comes from the tree, the vigor and life comes from the tree, but the individuality belongs to the branch. And part of what Christ does for us is takes each one of us and enables us to produce good fruit for the kingdom of God according to our own gifts and abilities that God has given to us. Each one produces what God has called us to produce. We don't all have to do the same thing, but we all draw from the same source and the same strength. That's part of the goodness that God gives to us. Pruning, in our context, is also effective. It doesn't have to do with removing the part that's growing at the top. It has to do with bringing us down to what's important and what's essential. The year after Shirley and I were married, we were going to tour Europe. It ended up being hitchhiking around Great Britain, and we can tell you the story of that another time if you want, how we ended up with a truncated journey. But anyway, we were hitchhiking around, and we were from Canada, So people picked us up when they saw the Canadian flag. We hardly ever had to wait for a ride. There was one time I remember particularly, there was a long line of hitchhikers, and we thought we'll just keep going, walking, and get past them all so that they get the first choice of the rides. It's the only right thing to do. Well, of course, with our Canadian flag on the back, someone stopped and picked us up, and all the others were angry at us because we stole their ride. We were also very eager to develop our relationship with God. And as we began and ended each day, we prayed and read our scriptures. One morning, when we were camping outside of Glasgow, we prayed that God would give us patience think we'd been reading something in the scripture about patience, and we thought, that's a good thing to have. So we prayed that God would give us patience. And so we packed up our tent and took everything out to the road to hitchhike over to Edinburgh. And we were hitchhiking. Our Canadian flag wasn't working for us. We hitchhiked all day and never moved an inch. Finally, about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, a man stopped who was going this way to say, he was going that way. He said, I went that way in the morning to work, and I come back and you're still here. And I saw your sign that says Edinburgh, and Edinburgh's that way. So we went and got the campsite for another night. We had a good laugh. We were blessed. We saw this as an answer to God's prayer. We prayed for patience, and there we were giving an opportunity to be patient. So you really should be careful what you pray for. Well, over the years we've had opportunity to really need patience. A day delayed in hitchhiking is no big deal, but there are lots of other, as you all know, incidents in life where it's really important to have patience and many of the other attributes. And those of you who have experienced loss, or suffering, pain, seen friends, relatives, or yourself go through demoralizing situations, you know how much that prunes you. You're pruned because all of a sudden you realize that there are some things in life that don't really matter. And there are some things that do. And it's like all those extra fruits that never develop into anything. You can cut them off. You can let them go. You can shed all those things and come down to what's really important. And I've seen so many people who come down to, they understand there's only a couple of things that really matter. And we heard Joe read earlier today that very moving passage from 1 John about love. If love's not in us, what have we got? If we say we love God but we don't love each other, we're a liar, John says. When we understand what's important in life and when all those other things seem to fall away from us, we come down to the importance of loving one another and of loving God, of being true within ourselves to what we know to be true about God, to focus on what's important in life. And when we get narrowed down like that, pruned to the core, then it's pretty easy for us to understand and be able to share with others what is important in life. And as I said with the children earlier today, about the importance of being ready to tell others about our faith. There's only one or two things that you have left that you remember. If you're right down to the nub of it all, then you know what it is that others need to hear. Not about the latest technological toy that's available, not even about what's happening to the price of gasoline or the interest rate or whether or not you should be the first to get shares of Facebook, although that might be a good idea. What you understand to be really important is the love that we have for others, and to be able to share that love and to encourage that love within one another. In that passage from the Gospel today, Jesus said, "You are already clean by the word which I have spoken." That word clean gives the same sense as pruning. You've been trimmed back. My word has made you in a position where you're ready to do the work that you need to do. And we saw in the reading from Acts of the Apostles that Philip, having been pruned by the word that Christ had spoken, was ready to hear what the Spirit had to say, just as Jesus promised. In John chapters 13, 14, 15, those last words of Jesus before he went to the cross, he said to his disciples, "I will leave you, but the Spirit will come, and he will teach you all things that you need to know. Philip, listening to the Spirit, heard what he needed to hear and went and did the work that God had called him to do. When we allow God's grace to prune us, trim us back to what's important, then we're ready to grow and give all that we have to produce much fruit for God's kingdom.